Okay, once again, welcome everybody who's been able to join us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to have all of you with us. We are going to be spending about half an hour today on this webinar. And in that time, we're going to go through a number of slides in a presentation deck, of which for the majority, we'll be taking you through the story of CSS and so far how our company, Smarter E-commerce, has been dealing with CSS and what it has been able to do in terms of its reach to merchants. So let's begin. My name is Mark Haupt. I've been working at the company for about 3 years. I take care of the international clients for our business. That means the UK, the United States, and countries outside of the DACH region. I've got some experience with CSS now that goes back about 6 months. So I'll be able to speak with some experience and hopefully some authority to help queries. I will also be answering questions. We will group the questions together so that if there are similar themes, we can answer them with fewer answers and save time. But of course, if there are more specific questions, and there could even be technical questions, we will take a look at those and contact you directly. My email address is below, as well as my phone number, and you can contact me directly on that email address at any time you wish. Let's look at today's agenda. As I said, we have half an hour, so we don't have an enormous amount of time, and I want to move through the content that matters fairly quickly. We'll be looking at the introduction. That's just a quick bit about who we are, what we do. We'll be looking at CSS, what it means and why it's so important, why it's such a great development in the marketplace. The regulations that empower CSS, the complexity, the changeability, we'll take a look at those. And then we'll dive deeply into the setup options. So the types of CSS options that you can set up for retailers or if you're an agency for your clients. We'll look at the promises of CSS and so far what they've been delivering. So for example, we'll look at the double presence and what that means for overlap rates between CSS campaigns and Google Shopping Europe campaigns if you are using both. We will also then take you into the overlap rates of some of our own top CSS accounts, and that information will be shared with you, and I hope that will be useful. And then we'll dive back into the shopping tab, the opt-ins that drive the shopping tab, the differences between having the shopping tab opted in and just the pure CSS. And then, of course, the parts that we're all interested in, the vital industry performance insights. If we do have enough time, we will look at performance data from one specific account. So let's begin. Our company was founded in 2007. I won't spend too much time talking about us, just to say that there will be some attendees today that may have seen our presentation for the Germany marketplace. There's some shared content. There is some new content here. But, of course, if you did go to the Germany content, there might be some slides that will be familiar. Just move through those as you wish. We should also say that if anybody is having any, it's unlikely, but if anybody's having any issues with audio or video, the compatibility mode on the software is available to you. Please use that. And with that, let's begin. So our company and CSS, we, as I said, have been in the business of PPC automation for 12 years now. So the enveloping CSS story we've been tracking since the early beginnings. So we saw that when Google was taken to court by price comparison sites in 2014, 2015, that this would eventually result in new regulations and potentially a new ruling on CSS. It was a dramatic ruling, and it happened in the summer of 2017 when Google opened up its shopping platform to comparison shopping services. Now, these were traditional price comparison sites, and as well as newer, more specific and focused agencies that had been dealing with CSS or had been dealing with Google Shopping for quite some time. So while the CSS program does help Google fend off yet another fine, merchants who choose to join this and who choose to become part of the CSS shopping auctions in Europe via a CSS platform can reap significant benefits from using that. And we are going to look at some of those benefits today. So the bidding power, the increase of impressions, the potential impacts on conversions, the potential saving of cost and margin, all of these benefits are baked into CSS and can be used in different ways to apply the goals of specific campaigns. The timeline for getting us to this point, which is where we are today at the end of January, is pretty clear. The slides will be available to you, but you can see just from a summary point of view that our CSS, we are a CSS partner, and we're running at the moment about 350 accounts through CSS, and we have about 15 million products under CSS management just here at SMEC. We are one of the biggest providers in Europe. We're number 2 in Germany. And in the United Kingdom, where there is a vast CSS marketplace, we're in the top 10. So we ourselves meet all of the CSS requirements. And of course, as most of you may know, Google have just released new requirements for being a qualified CSS. And we'll go into some of the reasons why they did that and how we've responded to that later in the webinar. So behind the scenes, what is happening at smec.shopping, which is our CSS-enabled website? You can see that we have 65 plus merchant domains per target country. So we easily qualify, and we've got a lot of inventory that is in our system now. We have about 24 million products under management through our CSS platform. That's a huge number, but it's nothing compared to the number that we manage in total terms for all of our Google Shopping clients. You can see that we have about 1 billion ad impressions going out per month on our CSS links in the PLAs for Google Shopping. So that means that there's about 1 billion impressions which will be marked by SMEC across the 350 merchants that we manage. About 400 of our clients advertise via SMEC Shopping, some fully with our integrated platform so that we manage GSE as well as CSS, and some using our link-only services, by far the minority. And then about 204,000 visits to our SMEC Shopping website per month, growing at around about 5 to 10% at the moment. A big jump late last Q4 is expected, and we're expecting steady growth as the year goes by. So fulfilling the EU regulations is not a simple and straightforward story. The requirements that Google have made to become part of the CSS program and continue to be included in it are getting tougher. And the recent set of regulations that were imposed was that they, at Google, wanted to make sure that the CSS platforms that were in the program were truly useful in terms of usability and in terms of design and usefulness for the end consumers. So one of the parameters that was set to be a minimum was that the sites themselves needed to offer sorting or filtering options. That means on the left-hand side of the page or other parts of the page, normally there's a choice where you can filter through products using various fields. Product price being the most critical, that has to be included, and at least one other dimension that would be relevant for consumers. So things like the size of clothes, different brands, or in home and garden products, the type of product it was, desk, door, whatever it may be, depending on the sector or the vertical. The other requirement was that the CSS should show offers from at least 50 distinct merchant domains per country that they target with shopping ads. Very important. All the CSS need to meet these criteria by tomorrow, the 31st of January, to continue to participate. Now that's quite big because it means quite a few of the CSS companies or platforms set up in the last 6 months will not qualify. So it will be very interesting to see in a few weeks' time who is still there. Google themselves will conduct checks, and they will ask, and they may ask certain CSSs to provide evidence that they meet this requirement. So there will be a period of time when evidence is submitted and Google is checking that, but we expect to see that by about the end of February, and indeed officially from February the 20th, offers targeting countries where your CSS does not meet the 50 merchant minimum will instantly be disapproved by Google. So just to let everybody here know, SMEC Shopping is already confirmed to meet the new requirements. As I said earlier, 65 plus merchants, that grows by about 3 every week per target country. In addition, we are also working on implementing and optimizing product unification on the sites. And of course, our focus on our user-centric product search is critical, and our developers give that a lot of attention. Right, fulfilling the EU regulations and the tough requirements that are underlying that, as you can see here, we've taken a screenshot here from the Google page to sign up as a comparison shopping service. And what I've just said to you in terms of the new regulations starting on the 31st of January 2019 are laid out very clearly there. And of course, both of those points are included in the slide I just gave you. So feel free, of course, to look at that site. Google do offer a very helpful service, and there's a lot of updates that they put there. So that changes quite frequently. And you can see this page again, checking that the CSS compliance. Google are doing this extremely thoroughly now. So the merchants that are represented by the particular CSS are obviously shown on a page, and this can be checked as well. And I think that site is live now. So different CSS companies will probably be doing this in earnest all throughout the month of February to make sure that they do comply. So now we come to the part of the webinar where it's very important to focus on the setup options that are available for a CSS. And if you're a merchant listening today, or if you're an agency that represents merchants, these slides are particularly crucial in some of the decisions you may make on how you prioritize a CSS program going forward, or how you take your existing CSS program and improve, optimize it for the future. The first one, and we like to call this reassignment. So we say here we have a CSS account only that is going to be operating for a merchant campaign, and that means that the current Google Shopping campaign, we call that Google Shopping Europe, is simply reassigned to the CSS. That means that the name is changed to the CSS and the data is all transferred over, and essentially there's no change in the way that the Google AdWords account itself works. So the bids, the campaign structure, the way in which priorities are set, the way in which costs and conversions are calculated and used for further bidding strategies doesn't change. It's just that it changes from a GSE account, Google Shopping Europe, to a CSS account. Now, of course, bidding strategy and the outcomes of how those bids work, when you take into account that CSS has built-in features like a 20% automatic discount on CPC, do apply when the reassignment is completed. It's just that the reassignment is the name change convention from moving from GSE to CSS. There are advantages and disadvantages, and we'll focus on these in a bit more detail now. So the advantages of reassignment is that there is no ramp-up phase. That's important. That means that all of the data and all of the metrics and all of the history are simply transferred across in a name change, and there is no need for any learning or ramp-up phase. So there is no speed, there's no loss of speed in terms of being able to use the new advantages for performance outcomes. So basically no changes, except that the CSS advantages and the advantages from the CSS link are now applied in the accounts that used to be Google Shopping Europe. But there are some disadvantages that are worth noting. Firstly, you can miss out on traffic from the shopping tab, which you were getting previously, if your CSS is not opted in. So that's important, and that should be looked at if you are serious about reassignment. A new account or campaign setup would be required if you were going to advertise on GSE or via Google Shopping Europe again. So you would need to literally look back and set up a new campaign or a new account for your GSE if you were going to use both of the auctions concurrently. And of course, feeds that do not target the European Economic Area are taken offline in this scenario. Now, what we call the new account setup is what we focus on with this slide. So as you can see beforehand, you've got the GSE working with Merchant Center and Google Ads, very familiar to anybody who's working with Google Shopping already. And when we set up with CSS on the new accounts, we create a new Merchant Center and a new Google AdWords account for CSS. So what you see on the right-hand side of the slide essentially is the classic scenario where you continue to use GSE, obviously assigning it with its own budget and its own objectives, but you are also now using CSS, feeding through from the same MCA of the partner, but with a distinct Merchant Center and a distinct Google AdWords account. This is how the majority of our Tier A and upper Tier B merchants at Smarter E-commerce work, because they want to bring the advantages of having things like overlap, double impressions, and clearly they want to see how they can save money on one auction and potentially spend it in another, depending on the dynamics and the outcomes of both auctions. The advantages and disadvantages of both in this scenario are worth focusing on in more detail. So firstly, the advantages of setting up a new account is that the frequency of double presence on Google Shopping search result pages increases. That's very important, because if you want to increase your scope and scale on this channel, then having a separate account running through the CSS is going to achieve a lot of that for you. The CSS and GSE accounts can be steered separately, but they need to be assessed as a single performance unit. That's very important, because what you are doing at the end of the day is you're deploying a budget and using the budget for the same means and the same outcome, but building it into a separate campaign so that you can use the advantages of that campaign on CSS to achieve your objectives. So you can share budget, you can increase budget and use extra budget in the CSS. It all has to be steered separately, but it needs to be assessed when you look at it as a single performance unit. Feeds that do not target the European Economic Area can now continue to be managed through the existing Merchant Center, because you still have your Google Shopping Europe account. And again, this is an important point which we'll touch upon in the next slide. This will ensure that your products are shown in the shopping tab. That's important if your CSS is not opted in and you want to continue running adverts through the shopping tab, which is an important part of Google Shopping. It's Google Shopping's own price comparison software, if you like, that is built into the platform. The disadvantages of a new account mean that each additional CSS increases the complexity that you have or you may have in managing, evaluating, and analyzing your shopping ads. So you can add as many CSS as you like, but we find that best practice means that you keep it to one CSS, because each one that you add increases complexity, increases data sharing, increases the load that you will have to do in terms of analyzing and optimizing performance. So if you do not assess CSS and GSC as a single performance unit, you do risk making the wrong assumptions. We have seen one or two examples of that taking place. Both have to be looked at as separate spheres, but then the data has to be brought together and it has to be analyzed in overall, as I said, in one single performance unit. You obviously have to take a ramp-up phase if you are starting a new account. Because it's a separate auction, it involves separate competitors, separate dynamics in terms of feeds that you may be competing with, and obviously the bids that people are making or competitors make on CSS differs in as much variety as it does on Google Shopping Europe. So there's a period of time needed to get the correct data into the system. That means the numbers of impressions, costs, and conversions have to be factored and weighed in, and then the CSS can be put into a mode where it operates independently and achieves its own objectives. So what do we mean, if we go back, by double presence and overlap? Frequency of double presence on Google's search result page increases. That's an important statement, because what that implies is that there will be overlap between the products that are showing from your catalog, some coming through CSS and some coming through GSC. That implies double presence. That is a massive advantage when it comes to outshining competitors, pushing out auctions where potentially you were not involved with before, but where you can now bid safely, and also getting the advantage of making sure that every search query is almost double covered by products from your catalog. The overlap rate is something which indicates where there's commonality in the search auction between CSS and Google Shopping Europe. As you can see in the example that we've given you here today, by dominating search results with ads by Google and by SMEC is just referring to our smart shopping site, which we've set up at Smart e-commerce. That's running through CSS. You can see in the example above that we have two different auctions going on. We have the CSS auction by SMEC, and on the right hand of that, we have by Google, which is the Google Shopping Europe. So it's the same merchant, different products, but essentially a kind of domination on that search term has come into the auction outcome for this particular merchant. So merchants who use CSS and Google Shopping Europe, or to CSS in general, can achieve double presence on Google Shopping search result page. Ads by competitors often only show in the extended section, which you see an example of below. So again, to come back, if you are the kind of marketing organization that really does need to bring in the maximum amount of traffic and eyeballs, CSS has just opened up a world of opportunity. And not only that, it's enabled many of the merchants that we work with to surface parts of their catalog which were perhaps not getting any attention before, just by using one of the auctions, Google Shopping Europe. So that slide is pretty clear for what it's meant by achieving domination on search results using both Google and CSS. So as you can see here, we come back to the overlap rate, and this is where the outranking share metric can be analyzed and measured. And you can see, for example, traffic generated via the CSS will show in your auction insights reports in your AdWords account. If you use several partners, you will see aggregated numbers, but they should be fairly accurate numbers, and they should be updated in a real-time basis. So the overlap rate definition is how often another participant's ad on the CSS received an impression when your ad on the Google Shopping Europe auction also received an impression. And the outranking share is the number of times your ad on Google Shopping Europe ranked higher in the auction than another participant's ad CSS. And it's very clearly laid out in that table. In the example where we've highlighted for you, you can see that there's a 34.5% overlap rate, which meant there's almost an outranking share by 30%. So again, advantages really do come in to CSS from this metrics point of view, and that just means that more eyeballs are seeing adverts from your catalog than they are potentially from competitors who may not be set up in a similar way or using CSS in the way that we're recommending here today. So multiplying presence on Google's search results page. What affects this overlap rate that we've just spent some time looking at? And the question really to ask is, how often did my Google Shopping Europe ads receive an impression when my CSS ads also received an impression? So again, we've used the example that we showed you on the previous slide. And what's important to remember here is that double presence is reinforced only if you have a Google Shopping Europe account plus at least one existing CSS account. If you only have one account, of course, you will not see, and you can only see the overlap rates of competitors. So you can only see the overlap rates of pure competitors. And a crucial factor for search engine results presence is bidding. Now, obviously, the higher the bid, the more, or the higher the likelihood is that your ads will be shown. So as CSS ads are not subject to margin deductions, they usually show more often than Google Shopping Europe ads. So that's an important factor. And products with lower bids might become eligible to show via CSS as no margins there will be deducted. So what is the average overlap rate of our top CSS accounts? That is the accounts that we manage here at SMEC. Well, we can see here that our average overlap rate, we looked at, to get you that metric, we had a look at our 20 most influential CSS accounts from Germany, Austria, and the United Kingdom. SMEC CSS campaigns generated 420,000 clicks and 600,000 in conversion value. That's extra conversion value for the clients that we used in this sample. The analysis covered several companies from 7 different verticals: office supplies, fashion, electronics, general retailers, sporting good, pharmaceuticals, and home and garden supplies. And the average monthly ad spend was between 25,000 euros and 1.5 million euros per month. So the performance development on these accounts. The question here, what is the average overlap rate of our top accounts? And we've taken a bar graph over here. And as you can see, the average overlap rate across those accounts is almost 20%. Expressing that in another way, in 1 out of 5 auctions, ads from the CSS auction and the Google Shopping auction are shown. So everything above that line over there are outliers, the average being 20%, but you can see that there are some significant gains being made by merchants who are using the 2 accounts in a very synchronized, very managed way. And of course, the advantages from having that overlap rate at a higher percentage than not means that the likelihood is your conversions are going up and your average basket value is also going up because you may be targeting different types of users. And of course, you may also be experiencing the benefits of extra traffic for a cheaper price. That means you're able to bring many more visitors to your website for the previous price you were paying on CPC just to bring them in through Google Shopping Europe. So again, from our point of view, the CSS program has been a great success indeed. Of course, there are always exceptions, and there are some merchants who may not have experienced the benefits to the level that they'd hoped for. But again, the dynamics of auction, size catalog, size budget, and competition in various markets all come into play with these auctions, as they always would. So let's summarize that. In about 20% of cases, the Google Shopping Europe ads and CSS ads receive an impression at the same time. So the double presence multiplies brand exposure for these retailers and is reinforced if you have both the Google Shopping Europe and CSS accounts. So we focused in a few slides back on the impact of the shopping tab, and we talked about the importance of being opted in. So the shopping tab impact is one that is often debated in PPC forums and formats. People have very different experiences of the shopping tab, and in some countries the shopping tab is very much more important than other countries, but we see it as a critical part of the Google Shopping conversion cycle, and we know that the audience using the shopping tab are a high funnel audience. That means these are people serious about product searching, and they want to make a decision quite quickly once they've found the information. As you can see over here, the Google Shopping tab, the GSC Google Shopping tab on the left-hand side, and the comparison shopping tab on the right-hand side, both of those are included, and the clicks generated in that tab can both be counted because CSS is included in that tab. So the great unknown variable for marketers on Google Shopping is, of course, the shopping tab performance. So this is because the potentials of this particular tab are difficult to understand. Google don't particularly publish a lot of information or metrics on the tab itself, but it's important to not only know what the potentials of the shopping tab are going to be, but also how much of your money is actually spent on being present on the shopping tab and other properties. So again, looking back at our 20 accounts, we found that on average 13.7% of the ad spend accounts for the shopping tab itself. So on the other hand, comparing the ROAS before and after our shopping tab opt-in shows us that there is an increase in the average ROAS by 6.74%. And of course, these performance numbers were weighted to factor in the account size and the ad spend, just so we could apply some equivalence to that figure. So a ROAS increase in real numbers within the sample of up to 4.7%, 4.77%, again, given the same treatment with the equivalence of the upweighting. So the importance of setting up when you are using the shopping tab, again, comes back to the two models that we presented earlier. The first one being reassignment. The shopping tab coverage depends here on if you're opted in or opted out. So it's very important that if you want to be opted into the shopping tab, that it's done properly and it's done at your merchant center level. And of course, again, we help our merchants with this. So we go through this from a checking point of view once we've asked the questions about the goals and of course about the relative importance of the shopping tab. Now, when we apply the two accounts, in other words, we set up a new CSS account, this is where the shopping tab coverage is just ensured. It's just built in automatically. And of course, that's an important and very critical part of the collection process for the 20 merchants that we showed you earlier. The shopping tab generates the, depending on the merchant itself, it can generate between 15 to 20% of the revenue on a given day. Of course, it all depends, again, on the catalog type. And there's many, many factors that come into rating the importance. But when you go with Google Shopping Europe plus CSS, your shopping tab coverage is ensured. Now, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, if we had some time, we would look at some industry insights. Since we do have some minutes left, I'm going to take the liberty of showing you some of these industry insights. Let's begin here. So we take a look at 25 key accounts across the 5 verticals. The coverage and scope that we look at here are 5.7 million media budget per month in total, 1.8 million products in total, and again, generating almost 9.2 million clicks per month. The industries covered are fashion and shoes, consumer electronics, garden construction, generous retailers, sports and outdoor retailers. And this really is quite a revealing slide, because what this will show us is that in the short time that it has existed, CSS has had a significant impact on these retailers. Now, something that I should say here is that we will be collecting and updating new data on a daily basis. So we've just come through a very busy Q4 season, which was preceded by the early take-up of CSS and lots of different behavior from lots of merchant retailers on how quickly or how accurately they wanted to move their CSS over using the performance metrics they had. So of course, these are changing numbers, but what we see in this candlestick graph here is that the average CPCs, we see outliers, we see impressions, we see clicks, conversion rate, return of ad spend, and conversion value. And then the average is represented by the dots in the middle, the thicker circle, and the outliers at each end of each candle. So to summarize that quite quickly is that we saw that the average CPC actually decreased by 9%. Again, that was the auction advantage promised by the CSS program. Of course, the 20% is what Google have advertised the program with, but in real time, that gets changed by Dynamics themselves. And you can see that the average over there is 9%. We saw that impressions and clicks increased by quite a large number, 17%. That's quite a huge jump. If you're a small merchant, that's a significant difference in your exposure. If you're a large merchant, that's enabling you to literally eat up competitor impressions and space, which before you didn't have. So the branding power, if you like, of increasing impression and clicks increased by 17% and 16% respectively for clicks. Conversion rate, of course, the all-important measurement of what baskets are closing and checking now. We saw a 12% lower conversion rate due to the fact that more generic impressions and traffic were being generated by the CSS. Now, of course, a 12% lower conversion rate might look like something negative, but in fact, it's nothing to worry about if you're using CSS in the right way. A lower conversion rate just means that efficiencies and metrics and ratios are being calculated differently, and the lower conversion rate could mean that it was specific and planned for. But in general, with these merchants that we're showing you here today, that's what we saw as a conversion rate change from the CSS launch. Then we look at return of ad spend, which is the critical metric. So an impressively stable ROAS is the outcome that we see so far. And that's really shown up in the numbers that we see every day. So if we have an account which is now on GSE and CSS, and the traditional GSE ROAS was 8, what we have found that within a couple of months, the CSS ROAS is almost at 8. Sometimes not quite hitting 8, sometimes going over 8. It's often just a couple of percentage points below, nothing serious. But again, that indicates that the increased impressions, the higher fulfilling of existing demand means that there might be a little bit of pressure on ROAS, but nothing dramatic. And we could very impressively report that we've seen a stable ROAS in our experience. Moving down towards conversion value, the increase of 10% that we have found on average in conversion value means that the combination of using both auctions has increased this important metric. The account growth in general terms, to summarize, increase of budgets from our point of view by almost 10%, and on average 52% of the total spend that we looked at in that slide before has been allocated to CSS. And that's an important confidence metric. It's meant that more than 50%, so more than half of the budget of the ad spend being spent has been moved over to CSS. And of course, that wouldn't happen unless CSS was performing at the required metric. So we have now reached the end of the webinar. We've reached the end of our half hour. We will probably not have time to go through the further slides, and we will take any questions and answer those questions. Let me see if there are questions now that have opened up, and see if there's any that can be answered quickly. Right. Okay. So question here from Pierre. Have you got enough clients from France? Good question, Pierre. We do have, we meet all of the requirements for all of the EU countries, okay? But in France, we are a country, we are a company that isn't present in a primary way in that marketplace. We don't have an office in France, and we welcome French merchants. And in fact, if there are French merchants out there, or you yourself have French merchants to recommend to us, we would be very happy to have that conversation with you. Please use my email address, which is provided to you on the slide deck, and we will answer you back directly. We do have a French speaker as well. Now, there are no more questions for now. Let's see, there may be one more before we close the presentation. And the question is, if you use Google Shopping Europe and CSS at the same time with the same catalog, doesn't this cannibalize the campaigns and increase the CPCs? The answer to that question is no, it doesn't, because the two auctions are treated completely separately. They run off completely different algorithms by Google, so that there are two different catalogs. It's the same catalog, but it's running through two different merchant centers, and the search query obviously will trigger relevant products for that search query, but Google will not surface the same product from GSE and CSS. There might be cannibalization to the degree that you might see more products of a similar line, but they will never be the same product. And of course, the CPC increase, if it does occur, increases because of competition from other merchants. Of course, that can all be very well controlled by setting the right targets. ROAS is something that's critical to CSS as it is to Google Shopping Europe. And our merchants at SMEC, at Smarter E-commerce, who use us, set ROAS targets per auction. So that if we do start to see that any price clashing or cannibalization looks like it might be a trend, we can fix that straight away. But from Google's point of view, that is not supposed to happen. Okay, now let's look at the last two slides before we conclude the presentation. As you can see, there were many more slides there to go through, but I think you'll get the gist of those, and you'll be able to interrogate them yourselves and come back to us if you are wanting more information from us. So, conclusions and learnings from this webinar and from the information we showed you with our clients that we are working with. Merchants who choose to join the shopping auctions via a CSS can reap significant benefits in terms of bidding power and visibility on Google Shopping. Choose a CSS provider, and this is advice from us, that absolutely fulfills Google's requirements and possesses Google Shopping know-how. Because if you are working with a CSS provider that somehow isn't going to fulfill Google's requirements, your time and investment there could easily come to nothing, and that obviously could be quite a bad business outcome, needing to make a sudden change, where if you are working with someone who fulfills the requirements, just check that they do and make sure that you're in the right place. and this is more critical than the last one. They need to possess Google Shopping know-how. They need to be doing this. They need to be experienced. They need to have a wide degree of category experience, and they need to understand how data and syncing works between the two auctions. If that knowledge is in place with a CSS who fulfills those requirements, you're in a pretty good place to get campaigns off to a flying start on CSS. If you haven't done this already, talk to your CSS provider to make sure that the above is complied with. So don't risk it, and don't risk approvals, because Google can make some sharp decisions, and there might be things that they see that you don't see, and before you know it, you do have a problem. So just make sure that you ask your CSS provider directly if they do comply. And then choose a CSS setup option that makes sense for your account. Now, accounts are vast and very, very different. We have catalogs that have got 1.5 million products. We have catalogs with 800 products. We have competition that's intense in some categories, and in some countries it's not that intense. The point is to have an understanding of where you sit in the ecosystem of your country and your category, and obviously then make the decision about your CSS setup based on those two things. So if you have very high competition and you know that your competition potentially is reaching more customers than you, then setting up and having a CSS account early will be a good option for you, so you can start to test what part of that demand you can fulfill that you couldn't get to with your GSE account alone. Double presence is reinforced. If you have a Google Shopping Europe account plus CSS account, you've heard me say that a few times, highly recommend that. The overlap rate can be as high as 40%, as we saw on the candle graph. It really does make a huge difference for the right kind of campaign. And the overlap rate leads directly to higher baskets, or to higher basket value, and to increased baskets, even if sometimes the ROAS can be a little underperforming. It's normally only like that at the beginning until the equilibrium is reached. And of course, don't miss out on shopping tab placements by selecting a double account approach, or on a CSS, make sure that you are opted in on the shopping tab in your merchant center. And of course, important to note that time is advancing very quickly. CSS is happening on a daily basis with massive amounts of change. There are different actors moving in different streams, some high priority on spend, some low priority on margin. We will continue to evaluate CSS performance, and we will continue to update the marketplace with the trends that are occurring and the insights that we see after a new shopping cycle is over. So we've just come out of Q4. By the time we get to the end of Q1, no doubt some of this data will be updated, and we will keep our marketplace informed. So we hope that you've enjoyed this today. It's been a pleasure having you all here, and I'm looking forward to engaging with anybody who wants to ask me any questions on my email. And with that, I will greet you and hope to see you on the next SlideShare webinar that we do with you. This is Mark Haupt signing off. Linz, Austria HQ, Smarter E-commerce. Thank you very much.